We have three panelists today. I believe you can see them in spotlights. First one is Valerie Armstrong. She's the Chief Inclusion Officer of American Water. Second one is Christine Geisler. She's the Global Senior Vice President of Human Resources at Reckitt. And third one is Armand Kingsley. He's the Chief Diversity Officer of Atlantic Health Systems. So a big welcome to all of our panelists whose organizations have won various kinds of diversity awards. So let's get started with this question of what does inclusion look like? And I got two audience questions actually. They're interested in what kind of metrics you use and what kind of ways, how do you measure impact of inclusion? So let's start with Christine. Would you like to get started? You're on mute.
Sorry, I didn't realize it jumped back on mute as I came over. So I'll have to watch that if we go into breakouts. But the biggest thing about measuring any efforts on diversity and inclusion is that there is no one size fits all and there's no great answer. And being in a global role myself, the other thing that makes it more challenging is that it is different solutions and different answers and different things you can talk about around the globe. And so it's not even one size fits all within one company. There's certain things, for instance, that we report out, and we've just made a decision that we were going to report out our gender equity and pay results every year. And we were going to do that regardless of country. But it's in some countries it's important, in some countries it's not. So even in terms of measuring, it becomes difficult. But there's so many ways to measure, and it can start with your employee engagement surveys, and I highly encourage roundtable discussions, smaller forums to really get at some of the feedback that you need to hear. In addition to the smaller forums and the focus groups and so forth, I think, one way to measure is also, I mean, you see it, how willing are employees to tell their story? How do they feel, how comfortable do they feel? How safe do they feel at your organization? And, there's some measurements that aren't written, and there's some measurements, that we have in terms of analytics and telling you exactly what the numbers are and what they mean. The last thing that I know I'm bouncing around a little bit on it, and maybe it's my cold drugs today, but the last thing that I'd impart with you on measuring is it's all about the story. And you have to be careful with analytics because you can use it to paint the story that you want to, and that isn't always the right thing to do either. But you can use it to tell a story of really, truly facts. And what I mean by that, a perfect example of that is, what if I said our organization was at 30% gender equity? In terms of we had 30% female, let's say at the leadership level, 30% females at the leadership level. And maybe that was our goal this year. And so we're like, yay, hip, hip, hooray, this is great. What if I took the analytics of that story and said, okay, based on our hiring rate today, based on exactly the formulas of what we're doing today, what would be the predictive analytics of when we could get to 50% parity? And what if that answer was in 78 years? Well, okay, not so yay, not so proud, not so excited about that 30%. If it's going to take us 78 years to get to gender parity. So, what you can do with the analytics and the facts to tell factual stories is really important, because that's how you can really grab the attention of people and let them know if it's working or not working. So you can see the difference. It would be very easy to say, yay, we're at 30%. That's where we needed to be. And if I let it go at that, I'm telling the story that I want to tell to feel good about perhaps the efforts that I've made in the last year. But if that story isn't the real story to gender parity, we've got to be honest and we've got to bring that out there. So I'll leave some time for my colleagues here.
Wonderful. Just a quick follow-up, Christine. So how did you tell the story then? How do you strike a balance between the two sides or two interpretations of that story, that particular story?
I just think you have to know enough about the analytics. And that's the problem. I'm kind of blessed because I've been surrounded by some really good people that are really strong in analytics, so much better than me, so much more talented, that can say, hey, Christine, yeah, you could say that, but I think you're telling it in a way that is slanted, that is biased. And so I have people that are willing to challenge me with the story, and willing to say, hey, here is the facts, that's not what the facts tell us. And so you have to make sure, because as we all go through change, as we all know, we can build facts to support our own stance. So how do you take a real strong factual analytical approach, but then, weaving it into a story is still telling the facts, but just making the facts come to life.
Great. Oh, thank you for the explanation. Val, would you like to share your perspective on measurements and how do you tell how inclusive an organization is?
Sure, and I'll ditto a lot of what Christine has shared here. Is that, I think a big part of it is listening and hearing from our employees in regards to employee engagement surveys and culture surveys, and being able to hear specifically what your employees are telling you, because I think it's a balance of being a top down but also a bottoms up approach. We don't want the ID&E work to be seen as, oh, this is being driven from corporate. This is a corporate initiative. And so therefore, it's very important that we're hearing from our employees and that they feel that they are a part of this journey that we're on as we're moving forward. And one of the questions that I see that came into our box here is around employee business resource groups and the advantage of having those. That's one of the engagement tools that we use to measure our employees and hearing from them in regards to what's important to them. We actually launched 4 employee business resource groups this year, and we intentionally put business as a part of our resource groups because our goal is to ensure that the work that they're doing and their conversations are tying back to business results. And so they spend time focusing on culture, careers of our employees, growth and development, as well as an impact to the community and the work that we're doing. And so we're measuring a lot of that work through our employee business resource groups and having leaders that are leading that work from across our organization. We also published this year our first I&D report where we were able to share demographic information and breakdown for our employees across our organization. And at American Water, we're actually located all across the U.S. We're not a global company, but we are U.S. Geographically dispersed organization with over 7,000 employees. And within that space, we serve a demographic, a customer base that's very diverse as well. And so it's important for us that we're tracking the hiring and retention of our employee base. We have a focus on women, racial and ethnic diversity as a part of our hiring metrics. And that's data that we share out very frequently on a monthly basis with our leaders in regards to what's the recruitment of individuals into roles across the company that represent women, racial, ethnic diversity, but also what's the retention rate? Because what we're seeing through a lot of our analysis is that while we may be doing a really good job hiring individuals in, where we're struggling, which I know we'll talk about this in a little bit, is the retention. And to me, that's a clear indicator that there's probably some cultural issues that you're dealing with within your organization if you're not able to retain these diverse individuals within your workforce. So, those are some of the key areas there that I would say from a measurement perspective. And then I would just wrap it up by saying that I think it's important that for organizations to define what does an inclusive culture look like for you. Our inclusive culture at American Water may be very different than a company that's down the road. So you have to determine what are those values that are important for your culture. And for us, is having an environment of dignity, respect for all, and also a culture where we have zero tolerance, where there's individuals that are discriminatory practices that are taking place or things along those lines. So I think it's important to identify what that is. And that also allows you to begin your journey in this area.
Oh, excellent. Thank you, Val. First of all, I applaud your effort to share your demographic information. A lot of organizations do not want to share or are afraid of sharing. So kudos to you. I want to follow up just very quickly. How do you measure culture? You mentioned dignity, respect, zero tolerance. Do you ask for people's perceptions, their experience of these? How is that reflected in the survey?
We do, and that's through our employee culture survey. We specifically have questions within our survey that speak to fair treatment of employees and their perspective there. A lot. Also, we specifically ask about having an inclusive culture within our organization. And then lastly, we actually weaved in a question around equity this year as we're evolving the work that we're doing with I&D. And we know, and we'll talk about this also during our time together, inclusion and diversity is changing each and every day. And for us as an organization, it's important for us that we are not staying in a box and we're continuing to evolve with it. So equity has been a big part of our work as we're moving forward with our strategic plan.
Thank you very much, Val. Armand, and you mentioned earlier that you actually helped the organization to build up its DEI functions. Could you talk about how that journey was like, especially in the perspective, how did you build up measurements and people's experience of inclusion?
Sure, happy to, and thanks for the invitation. So I joined Atlantic Health System almost 3 years ago, and I was the first Chief Diversity Officer. This is the first time they've had an Office of Diversity and Inclusion. And to be quite honest, I was in Washington, D.C. I was at the time working at Kaiser Permanente, so I loved the city. I was in a nice space and a nice position. But what drew me here was the opportunity to build. We have a 6-hospital system here, and it was the opportunity to pool what was happening. There was, some pseudo diversity initiatives happening, but it was an opportunity to build and create a foundation of what diversity and inclusion would be like for the system. So in doing so, of course, to Val and Christine's point, you got to build and be able to measure those initiatives simultaneously. So there was a lot of running and flying the plane and building the plane as we were flying. So we look at it similar to what was said, as diversity, inclusion, and equity. Similar, but still different in their own rights. So you have to be able to uphold those and make sure they stand alone, but also integrated. So we do a lot of work around pay equity, and of course, all that is measured similar to what was shared. We do a lot of work around diversity, laying the foundation of what is diversity at Atlantic Health System. Not only what it is for our employees, but what is it for our patients that are walking in our door? And how do we make sure that from a patient care perspective, we can meet the needs of those patients walking in the door? Keeping in mind that in healthcare, there's a number of laws and policies that we have to abide by around diversity and inclusion. And then you layer on top of that, this issue of a pandemic for the last 2 years, and the diverse patient population and the cultural beliefs that came in along with the pandemic. So it's been an interesting and challenging time to be working anywhere, I'll say that, working anywhere, but in healthcare, it's been a little more challenging trying to manage both the employee diversity as well as our patient diversity, and then still keep a community lens on top of that. How are we reaching out to some of those community members? So we were building all of that throughout the pandemic and putting measurements with that as well. And similar to what Val said, we also use employee engagement surveys. We have 6 questions on our survey that culminate into an inclusion inclusion score. Of course, we can slice and dice the actual diversity data by various demographics. So we do look at them, like most organizations, separately, but then see also where the compilation's happening, where the intersections. How are we recruiting people in the door? I think Val nailed it on the fact that, our diversity recruitment is up this year, but what is our retention? So who are we losing on the back door? And when you have those numbers that don't equal out, there usually is a cultural challenge that's happening, which for us, we had to go back to our talent acquisition process and have a discussion about where are we sourcing? Who are we bringing in the door? Who's doing the interviews? What are the questions being asked? So there's a gap at the early part of it if we're losing people on the back end. So we had to tighten up the reins there, which is slowly but surely helping us on the retention side on the back end. So, you know, building a lot of it as we're going and continue to evolve. It's a journey that you never see the end of, because I think it was Val that said it's constantly changing. I think when I started, it was just the diversity department, and then it was diversity and inclusion, and now it's equity. And if we think about years ago, it was just the civil rights movement. So we have seen the transformation of diversity work over the years, and I'm sure we haven't seen the end of it.
So I just want to comment, because Armand said something so profound that and I know Val agrees with this. The issue, and to the question that Charles asked in the chat, why are some companies hesitant to share? Why do we pause about sharing our metrics, our analytics, even how we share it internally, much less externally, is because Armand had just touched on it just so briefly. Can you imagine if I say, boy, when we look at our inclusion index on our employee engagement survey, and it is at 85%, wow, wow, we're doing wonderful. It's great. It's above benchmark. Well, guess what? What if all of a sudden we do a cut? And we do that cut by asking, what do our individuals of color, what do our women feel versus men? What do individuals feel who identify, there's so many different ways depending on how you do your analytics. What if we ask these different groups, and then all of a sudden that 85% looks like 40%, but the numbers are small, and so it just rolls into that 85 and we look great. So I think people get so hesitant because the more you get into analytics is the more you know, which is great. But it helps to unwind, unravel, and learn more and more. And so at any spot in time, you can share a number, and that number is going to mean 3 different things. And then what's in that number is going to mean another 10 different things. And I think that's why companies and people get a little hesitant. So I hope you don't mind me commenting on that, Armand, but I think that's part of Charles' question on, why is there hesitancy? I think you're going to see more and more overall very bland, generic analytics for everyone until we get to really stronger analytics that people are going to be able to consistently understand what that means.
I agree. No, no, go ahead, Val.
I was going to say, you hit it spot on with that. I mean, there's a level of accountability that comes once you actually put that data out there and it's in the universe. It's hard to pull it back. And so there's a level of accountability that's placed on, well, what are we going to do to improve? Because our operation minds start to kick in there. And then also it reveals that we have gaps along the way. And so it's kind of like you're looking into that closet and you're seeing the skeletons that are in the closet that have been hiding, that not really many people have known about, which for us, at American Water, we did a full analysis internally, and we had a number of conversations, and we had to truly challenge ourselves as to why would we not share this data? Why would we not share where we're doing excellent work, but we still have room for improvement? And that was revealed in our inclusion and diversity report. And so you'll see next year, we're still going to have areas of improvement, but the key is that we're continuously moving the needle. And I think we all look at this journey of inclusion, diversity, and equity as it's more of a marathon, and it's a long marathon. It's not a sprint by any means.
And I'll just add, I think what both Christine and Val said is accurate. It's a balance of what do we want to share, and are we prepared to have the conversations once we share it. Something happened in 2019, in 2020, with, in addition to the pandemic, the civil unrest that happened across our country with the killing of George Floyd. Every single company came out with a diversity statement, their stance on their support for diversity and inclusion. The shift, however, this time, I think, is now employees are saying to that company, remember you put out that statement? So what are we going to do? What's the actions to the statement? What are we doing? What are we going to do about what we said we support? And we did the listening conversations. I think when, I think it was Val that talked about listening to your team. You know, when that killing happened, we went on a listening tour across all of our health systems or hospitals to make sure that people felt like their voice was heard, that they knew that we were empathetic to them having to deal with what was happening outside of our health system, come in here and deal with a pandemic 24 hours a day. And it was heavy for our team. So now we are now obligated to do something about that within the walls of our system. Can I control your behaviors outside of here? No, but I can definitely influence them. So if you're with me for 8 hours and we're expecting you to have these types of behaviors while you're with us, the hope is that that translates into your personal life, if that's not already part of your core. But a lot of organizations are now having to have some internal conversations about, was that just a statement for show and tell, or are we serious about the work that needs to happen behind diversity and inclusion?
Well, thank you for the additional thread. That's really, really relevant. So a lot of organizations mention when their social events happen, they do listening sessions, and picking up on what you said, Armand, as well. So what are you listening for? What kind of questions do you ask? What are you listening for? And how do you take actions on them? Because I can imagine a lot of organizations doing that, but nothing comes out of it and people get discouraged, and that's not a successful practice. So how do you make it impactful, a practice, just having those listening sessions?
I'll just briefly give our example. When it started, there was 4 of us that decided to go on tour, so to say. My CEO, our Chief Human Resources Officer, our a head of psychology, and myself, because we knew that this was more than just a feel-good moment. Like, there will be conversations like we talked about around psychological safety and how much can I share at work. So we wanted to be sure that people heard from all different aspects of the business. But it was, we didn't go into it with an agenda. We went into it with opening remarks and then let the audience take us to where we needed to be. And when you think about where all of our hospitals are in Northern Jersey, just outside of Manhattan, but each one has its own unique, community. So the needs and the ask of each hospital was a little different. Those closer to the city, much more diverse in their demographics. They talked a little bit differently than some of our hospitals in our Western region, which is a little bit more suburban and rural. So we couldn't go into it with a preconceived idea of what they wanted or how they wanted us to respond. It was really, to Val's point earlier, listening. And then we did create an action plan after we finished to let them know we heard them, and that the stuff that we were putting into our strategic plan, they would be able to see their fingerprint on that strategic plan because we heard what they said. And I think it went a long way to them understanding that they were heard, and that we weren't just here on a listening tour, but there were follow-up actions that would happen.
Could you share 1 or 2 follow-up actions that you derived from that process?
So similar to Val, BRGs, business resource groups. When I entered Atlantic Health System, we didn't have any. After the killing of George Floyd, people wanted to be involved and they didn't know how to get involved. They didn't know where the space was for them to be involved. So we created 9 business resource groups in the last year, and they vary between demographics. We have one for working parents. So they constantly evolve. The working parents one came organically during the pandemic. People trying to juggle schools being closed and parents trying to work, and a lot of us are working from home and just juggling that. So some of the business resource groups weren't just by ethnic or racial demographics. So there's one for everybody in our organization. So I think launching that post the roundtables really helped them understand that we heard you and we're going to help find a way for you to get involved.
Thank you. Val, you also mentioned listening to employees a lot. What are 1 or 2 things that come out of those listening sessions, or in Charles' terms, maybe some grievances, and how did you take action on them?
So we actually, as a part of our employee business resource group, very similar to what Armand and their team did, is we held after the Derek Chauvin verdict came out, we knew that that was going to be very emotional for our employees within our organization. And we were prepared for that. So we were taking time leading up to that verdict, thinking through how are we going to address this internally within our organization. And we had the day of the verdict, we actually had a stand down across, I like to call it maybe a stand up across our organization, where our CEO as well as our Chief Human Resource Officer spoke with all of our employees in a virtual space across the entire company. We put all hands down, and they spent time speaking about understanding the impact of this, not only to our country, but to our workspace, and understanding that employees are going to be in different spaces with it. We don't really know. Some employees supported it, some may not have that outcome. But what was important for us is that when employees came into the workspace, that they were treated with dignity and respect. And so that message cascaded across the organization. And we actually built upon that later that day, where we had a community healing session is what we called it, where our Together We Stand, our Black African American EBRG, partnered with our Women's We Can EBRG, and they spoke about the impacts of what had occurred over the last year with George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, the impacts of that, personal impacts of that. And then we began to think through, how do we move forward? And the key to that was listening to our employees, taking those individual conversations back to the employee business resource groups, and creating a space within those resource groups to have continued conversations and dialogue. What we're hearing now, from our employees is that emotional safety, mental health and wellness, flexibility is extremely important to them. And so we're implementing, what are our plans as we're reintegrating back into the workplace and creating a level of flexibility with our employees, with work, and balancing that with home. But also we've got a strong desire of employees for mentorship and sponsorship programs within our company, which we historically haven't had. So as a part of our strategic plan that I've rolled out this year, we've got a 5-year strategic plan. We pulled all of that specific feedback in from our employees into the plan of we will be standing up a mentorship program for the company, and working through what the sponsorship look like. But more importantly, employees are wanting to grow and develop. And so how do we create development programs for employees that are interested in, well, maybe I don't want to be on this same career path that I'm on now, but I want to think about taking a veer in this direction and focus in this direction for my career. So we're seeing where it's employees, once their voice is being heard, we're hearing a lot more from them about what their workspace means to them and what the trajectory of their career looks like for them as well. And I think employees are getting to be a lot more comfortable in sharing that, not just with individual peers, but with their leaders as well in their respective areas.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Val. Christine, how about you? How does listening look like in your world?
Well, first of all, I love the expression that Val used on the community healing, platform, because that's really what those have become. Our listening sessions with our global CEO have been fantastic, and not because it's with the CEO, not because it's addressing some of the things going on around us in our communities, not just because of those things, but because it really educated people. The biggest issue that we sometimes have when it comes to inclusion is, I love the expression of headwinds and tailwinds. And some of us have had more headwinds and some of us have had more tailwinds. And, if somebody feels like they have had more tailwinds behind them and supporting them in their career and so forth, and haven't had some of these obstacles that others have had, to hear about those headwinds that others have had are like, wow, I had no idea. I had no idea that Val thinks about that with her children. And I don't even know if Val has children, but it's all of a sudden, it strikes a nerve with people to say, I really had no idea. And we've had employees that have been to tears and putting messages in the chats to say, oh my God, I had no idea. And I'm so very sorry. And what can I do to help? And what can I do to make a difference? And to me, that's how we start elevating our game. The problem with DEI is what we've done to date to this point hasn't worked. We haven't gotten to the place that we want to be yet. Has progress been made? Yes, but not to the point that any of us want. And you're right, Charles, there's accountability in that. We all have to get better. But for me, one of my beliefs is that we get better when we know more. And some of us have lived in a bubble and don't know. I mean, they literally don't know. And so how do we start shedding more of a light? And I think the last 2 years have done that. And it's been very powerful and very helpful in educating and shedding the light. So I think those stories, those listening sessions have been amazing, and the people that have partaken in sharing their stories, and companies that have created, not just our company, all companies that have created safety for people in those situations, I applaud, because it's been needed and I think very helpful in getting ourselves to a better place.
Thank you, Christine. I love the idea of headwinds and tailwinds. What is one example of a headwind you have experienced in your DEI journey? You have been marathoners, using Belle's term. You have been doing a lot of work in this DEI space. What is one challenge you have encountered? Christine, would you like?
Yeah, I mean, I can start. I would think one of the headwinds that I have had as an organization has been in the analytics, because I came from a company that had really super strong analytics, and I had great partners that I was referring to earlier. And I just switched to this company mid-pandemic, or near the beginning of the pandemic. So for me, all of a sudden asking for information and not being able to get it was probably a big headwind for me, because I didn't have accurate data. I wanted to share. I couldn't get the right employee counts, much less get the right, diversity counts and the right, other types of metrics that we needed. But that journey's changed significantly. So 2 years later, we're in a much stronger place and able to do that. But that was really one of the headwinds. And then for me personally, being new to the organization when, COVID was first hitting, and, Black Lives Matters was igniting at the beginning of that pandemic period as well, is for me, it was a capacity issue. And for those of you that, want to be part of the answer and want to be part of the solution, that's a very tough headwind, because you want to make a difference, you want to do what's right, but you just literally don't have enough arms and legs, because you're trying to figure out how do employees even work when they're not coming in the office and all of these other things. And for me, I was personally blessed at our organization because we had an enormous amount of people that stepped up. And it sounds like Armand might have had the same situation, as he was building all of these ERGs that hadn't been built before. Same thing for us, is we had people that just stepped up and started making a difference. And, we just gave them the freedom to figure out what that would look like and what that meant, and help them navigate along the way. But it really took an army. And a lot of people. I was just a small, piece of the puzzle. And so that was one of the headwinds, but I actually think it became a nice tailwind for all of us in the organization, because it was built by our people.
Very nice. Thank you. Belle, do you have an example of a challenge you have experienced?
Lots of challenges in this space. I would say probably the biggest one that we're dealing with right now is just ensuring that everybody is along for the journey. That's the challenging part. We are in the utility space, and water and wastewater in particular. It's a very white male dominated industry, and it's been that way for years. And so having this conversation and this prioritization around ID and E creates a conversation with employees, especially those white males, of feeling that they're being isolated. And this doesn't apply to them. This is only kind of that gender and racial and ethnic conversation that you all are having. And so that's been a continued challenge for us, of which our employee business resource groups are definitely a venue for us to be able to help in closing that gap. I think also it's about just hitting some of those challenges head on. You know, I'll share an example. We have a employee referral program, and you know, some of our employees were having concerns about, well, I'm referring individuals for jobs, but you're not hiring them. You're hiring all these women, and you're hiring all these racial, ethnic, diverse individuals that, in their mind, quotes, weren't qualified for the job. And it's one of those things when you start to, like Christine said, you dig into that data tells the story. So while you may have an individual that is looking at a person that's being hired, they're looking at it through that one particular lens of saying, oh, well, you hired this female to supervise our distribution crew, and this female doesn't have distribution experience or operations experience. So therefore, that's where biases start to come in. And the bias being there that, well, we only hired this person because she's a female and now she's not qualified for the job. So therefore, we're not hiring the right candidates for the job. So for us, it's about being being transparent relative to, hey, we do have an employee referral program. We want our employees to utilize that program, but it doesn't guarantee that that individual is going to be hired. And for us, we're going to always hire the best person for the role. So continuing to be open and transparent and trying to listen to, as I've shared, and all of us, our employees' concerns, but also being able to share back with them some feedback and data and information that will help educate them. A lot of times that's what it comes down to, is that education. And then, you know, recognizing that we do all have biases, and those biases will show up in some way, shape, form, or fashion, but how do you recognize them and get around them? And then ultimately that this is the company that we are. This is who we are. This is how we've identified the work that we're doing with ID&E. And I think from an employee standpoint, it's making that decision. Does this align with my personal values? Does this organization align with who I am and the organization that I work for? And unfortunately, we've lost some people because this isn't the place that they've identified for themselves, which is okay. And that goes back to kind of what I shared earlier. I think for organizations of, you've got to start this journey where you are and identify what your values are in this space and what inclusivity looks like for you and from a cultural standpoint. And you have to really kind of stay the course with that. And also continue to evolve where you're growing and learning from a lot of what other companies are doing in this space as well.
Thank you, Val. Armand, could you share an example of a challenge you've encountered?
Well, building, similar to like Val said, it's been a lot of challenges. But two front of mind is similar to Christine. Analytics and data was a challenge. Some of our systems don't speak to each other, so making sure that the data you did get was accurate data was key. So we're at a better space today, but that was a huge challenge. And the other one was policy did not align to practice. So we talked the game about being inclusive and being diverse and wanting to build equitable practices and procedures, but our policies, the written word, did not always support that. So I spent a lot of time, I'm not just always starting from scratch to write a policy, but tweaking existing policies to make sure that they were equitable. And to be able to have those conversations with people to know that, you know, what is our core? At the core of our system, what are our values, what do we stand by, and what's non-negotiable. You know, that zero tolerance policy, non-negotiable. You know, we don't waver on that. There was a lot of conversation around how what was the gray area, and you know, what we would put a stake in the ground for. We doing this work, and I'm sure Val and Christine understand this, is one of the biggest skill sets I think you can pick up is your ability to take diversity work and translate that into when you're having various conversations. So we talk about one of the questions posed earlier was around just leadership and making sure you got the support. And it's really, everybody doesn't understand your world in diversity and inclusion, but it's sometimes our responsibility to understand theirs. So my conversation with our CFO is very different from the conversation I have with my chief human resource officer, different from the conversation I have with procurement, different from the conversation I've had with our chief medical officer, because their lenses are different. And it's our responsibility sometimes to understand their lens to advance our work. So it's not I think Christine said it earlier, it's not a one size fits all, even within your own organization. You really have to understand the lane that people are looking at diversity and inclusion in. And for me, I have to understand some of the medical terminology so I can speak to a physician so that they understand, you know, what's the importance of sickle cell disease in African-American community. I have to understand from a financial perspective when I'm talking to the CFO, what's the importance of us spending $1 million with this diverse vendor that lives in our own community, and what's the repercussions of you know, giving them the business versus a big box shop. So those conversations I think are key, and they're starting to happen for me a lot easier now that I've been here a little while.
That's an excellent point, Armand. I really like that. Can we stay on that topic a little bit? Because we do have a question related to how do we persuade people to invest in DEI? Because some of the effects may be intangible. And you mentioned that people have different languages, live in different functional areas. And so could you say more about some examples of how you talk with the chief medical officer or CEO or chief operating or chief financial officer about the value of DEI, about your investment decisions?
Yeah, I think, and I want to appreciate the question, but I'm at a place now in my career that I no longer try to persuade you that this is the right thing to do. I'm lucky to work for an organization that I have the support of our CEO, that we know what we need to do. We know the work we need to do to better serve our team members, to better serve our community, to better serve our patients. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time persuading you what the right thing to do. I will absolutely have conversations and help influence and teach why this is important. But I think there's a difference there between me trying to convince you to do D&I work versus me trying to educate you why this is important for our community and our patients. So with that being said, most times, I haven't hit brick walls. It's usually a situation of people not knowing. I think Val hit it dead on about the biases we all bring into an organization or bring in anywhere, uncovering those biases so that they're not a hindrance to getting the job done. So I think there's a balance there of, you know, making sure that we can have those conversations and bring the data, bring the policy, bring the law into the conversation, because it's not always in the D&I space a feel-good conversation. It's some things that we just have to do in order to be compliant. So it's a balance. I'm sure we have a lot that we have to balance on a daily basis.
Thank you, Armand. Christine, do you have an example? Could you share some examples? Maybe not persuading, maybe helping educate people to understand the value of investments in DEI programs.
You know, I have to agree with Armand. Thank goodness we don't have to do that as much as we had to even 5 years ago, even 3 years ago. Right. I think people get it. And it really is about, to me, the persuasion is to take the time to get people to work on it. to understand how we can get better in that space, to get people to take a, bias test and to see what their biases are. I think we spend more time persuading on the smaller things versus the bigger, we need to do this. And again, I thank goodness for that. But it still is important to know, some things top of mind in terms of analytics and in terms of the fact that we know that, when you're looking at, Fortune 500 companies and that, those with diverse leadership teams, those with diverse boards, are more successful, are doing better, but the answer is, I think we all hopefully know this by now. So that, again, the influence is how we get better at it. And then convincing people, hopefully you've built enough credibility in the organization that you can do one of these, trust me. We're going to go through this course today talking about micro messaging, because it's just going to be eye-opening, because you don't realize how many micro messages we have in a meeting that you might not have caught, and it really is enlightening. So just trust that it's the right thing to spend the next half hour on tomorrow. And, hopefully it's just proving time after time again, yes, that was worth our time. Yes, we've all gotten a little smarter because of it. Yes, I'm catching myself, behaving a little bit better because of what you've shared and taught us. So, hopefully some of the time is spent more that way.
Thank you. Val, could you share some of your company seems to be well aligned in terms of support for DEI, but specific program wise, what are some ways you help people understand their DEI's value or program's values?
Yeah, I agree again with Armand and Christine. It's a no-brainer for us within our organization. It's an expectation. This is who we are. This is the work that we're continuously working to embed across our organization. So I'll frame it up similar to what Armand shared, is that it's really about education. And I can share some examples. While on the surface may not appear to be super huge, but they are very impactful. We have a lot of podcasts across our company, especially in this virtual space. We've lived and breathed Zoom and Teams and WebEx and all those formats over the last 2 years. And so as we've been holding a number of podcasts and conversations outside of the D&I space, but it could be on well-being, it could be on health, it could be on the pandemic. It was important for me that the individuals that are delivering those messages, that we have diverse individuals on camera. And so at kind of about 2 years ago, I started noticing, and this was before my role was in place, I was leading our Inclusion and Diversity Advisory Council, but we didn't have a Chief Inclusion Officer. So my role was just stood up last year as the Chief Inclusion Officer for the company. And so I would have conversations with our internal communications team about the importance that when we have a podcast, you all control who the speakers are. You control who we determine. So you've got to put on that lens of, am I having all white males or all Black females on this podcast? We need to diversify it. And so that conversation resonated very well with our director of our communications team. I spoke with our senior VP about it, and it's something that they have really put into practice. And to me, it speaks volumes to our employees. When you look at a podcast, when you look at a video that we share across the company, you want to look at it and see someone that looks like you. That's just that cultural part of us creating an inclusive organization, but it also makes you feel valued. I want to look at a video. I want to look at something where I see a Black female, or if there is, a Hispanic within our organization. That's just key in general. So that's just an example there of some, what I would say maybe a direct minor conversation that led to a pretty big impact for us. And I'll also share one thing that we're doing right now, and it goes back to the data piece that we've spoke about, and how important data is and analytics. We are actually conducting what we call an internal labor market analysis this year with a third-party vendor. And this third party is taking a deep dive into our hiring practices, promotions, which equates out to retention of our employees, performance evaluations and ratings that we have, as well as pay. And so what I'm seeing out of this work as we're continuing to evolve it is that we have opportunities. We have opportunities for how individuals within certain groups and organizations are being rated. Now, what do we do about that? That's where at this point, I have to take this data, and there's conversations that's held with those owners within those respective places of saying, well, we've got a gap here. And this is just an example. You know, we have a gap of maybe our African-American employees are being rated at lower levels than our white population. So what's causing that? Is it because we're saying that they are low performers and that's why they're having lower performance ratings? Or are there some areas of bias that are coming into here that we need to peel back and understand and evaluate? So I'm loving this work that we're doing here. So I look at it going beyond just the numbers, and it's taking that deep dive into how do we do some analytics around this data and this information.
Well, thank you, Val. Let's move on a little bit to the question of selecting DEI programs. And Val, you mentioned different vendors. And so I have actually two related questions from audience. One is asking about an earlier stage. So they're at earlier stage of the organization. They're just thinking of starting some DEI programs. Where do they start? And another related question is more in the middle stage. They started some programs. I know some organizations have started usually starting with training, right? Training easy to implement. And then, or they did some, created a dashboard to track different groups of employees. So how do they, then the question becomes, how do we build on that? Where do we go next? So what are, when decisions like those, adoption of DEI programs come up, what's your suggestion? May I go to Armand? Can I go to you first? Because you build it from ground up. So looking back, what's your insight in terms of where an organization should think about starting?
Sure. So I do think education is important, but we have to be cautious with diversity inclusion education, that it is sometimes looked at as punitive. So somebody says something wrong, so now you go and take this diversity training, versus being on the front end of us trying to upskill future leaders to build their skill set and build that muscle to be an inclusive leader. That should be the goal of diversity inclusion training, not as a punitive or retaliation because somebody did or said something inappropriate. So education, I think, is one of those underlying things that needs to be there regardless of what you're building. There's constant education that needs to happen. And I think Christine said it earlier that it's going to change depending on where your organization is on their journey. If you're just starting out, you want to get a couple quick wins under your belt so that people can understand the ROI for diversity and inclusion and how they tie to the work. So it could be something around supplier diversity. You know, how do you build that? It's a tougher build if you're just starting out. One of the toughest builds actually, because it involves so many different players. But start thinking about how do you start diversifying who you're working with externally? If that's vendors, if that's your talent acquisition team, who are they working with? Where's your company showing up at? Do you talk about career fairs? I think we all do some sort of career fairs, and now a lot virtual now, but pre-pandemic, you know, we were out with, you know, at career fairs, setting up booths, things like that. So where are we showing up? So prior to me coming, one of the challenges we had when I walked in the door was diversifying our nursing population. But we weren't taking advantage of some of the trade organizations. So now we work with the Hispanic Nurses Association, the Black Nurses Association, the Filipino Nurses Association, and they all have national and local chapters. So thinking about how do you get into your specific market, and it's not always just, I always preach that you can't just show up one time a year and wait for the career fair again next year. You have to build relationships so that if they need a guest speaker, we can send a nurse to do a guest speaker. If they have other networking or mentoring programs throughout the year, we're engaged in those as well. People want to feel like there's a mutual respect, even from a vendor to vendor relationship. So those are some of, I think, the low-hanging fruit. It does become more challenging where you're trying to build stuff across the system. The data becomes more challenging, et cetera. But I think some of the underlying things around, building an infrastructure for data, building a strategic plan, start diversifying your vendors, and education across your organization will be vital.
Thank you. Christine, would you like to add your perspective?
So there's so many resources out there. And I think tapping into each other, there might be somebody on this call that you can say, oh my gosh, Pat, let me, share with what we're doing. We're at the beginning of the journey, and I heard you're at the beginning of the journey. Let's go through this together. And I will say, even though I had a ton of experience with DEI, with my former company, I literally started reaching out here in the New Jersey area to see what else was going on and what could I learn from, what could we share. And sometimes it's even sharing speakers. It's sometimes, hearing from somebody within your group, it just doesn't, that's Julie. We all know Julie, or Marlon. We all know Marlon, and yeah, she's great. But also Marlon goes and talks at our company. And, as this amazing, diverse female, and, at our company, it's like, wow, I want to be like Marlon. And she had so many profound things to say. And so sometimes exchanging talent helps too. So use the resources around you. It doesn't always have to be expensive. And there's ways to share. Now, having said that, I will tell you, and I owe nothing to this company, but I will tell you the resources we're using with MindGym, a company that we're contracting with right now, have been incredible. And what I like about it, and for any company that you use, anybody that helps you, is it's very practical. I feel like we have to do things that educate, that make it non-threatening, because you want people to want to come on the journey with you. And so you can't, beat them into you have to help them to understand, why it's important, and to feel comfortable with it, and bring them on the journey. And you have to do it in very pragmatic ways. And this is what I like about the tools we're using with MindGym. They're teaching people so many things about micro messaging, for instance. Like, wow, I had no idea that could be a micro message that I would be sending to somebody, and how unfortunate, because I never thought of that. And I'm so glad that people are sharing these examples of micro messages, because I probably do them in a meeting. And it's things like that teach and educate in non-threatening ways. And then I also think it's just-in-time learning. And my piece on that is, for instance, when we do our talking talent sessions and succession planning, I spend at least the first 45 minutes talking about bias. Because again, how do you just bring it to light and remind? They've gone through the training, they've gone through all of this stuff, but how do I make sure leaders understand what it looks like and what it sounds like, and that any one of us in the room can be kind of an inclusion interrupter? And I steal that idea from somebody else I heard once. I love that. Anyone can be an inclusion interrupter to say, perhaps we could think about that a little differently. Or, it sounds like you might be making the decision, for Martha, because, she just had a baby, and you're assuming that she doesn't want to travel. And, from what we learned and talked about earlier, perhaps we shouldn't be making that decision, thinking that we're being kind, that we should be letting, Martha make that decision, and reach out to her and see if she has an interest in that role. And all of a sudden, people catch themselves. And if you can catch people in non-threatening ways, because we also have to understand that, yes, there are some bad people doing bad things. Absolutely. We all know this across any profession. But there's also some really good people who want to do the right thing, and sometimes just didn't realize that they weren't. And you'll have people that like, oh, I thought I was being nice to Martha because she had a baby and I think Martha's wonderful. And I just assume she wants to stay home and not travel. And I just assume, and, and we make a lot of assumptions and we think we're being kind and we're not. And our biases are making us make judgment calls that are poor judgment calls. So how do you catch each other in a way that educates, that stops people from doing the wrong thing and does it in a non-threatening way? You've got to open up that communication. So like an inclusion interrupter is knowing that any of us in this call could say, Christine, can I just challenge you on what you just said? Because I actually think that's not being inclusive. And okay, great. Let's talk about that. I wasn't catching that. What am I missing? So again, how do you create that sense of safety? So sorry, I digressed a little bit, but I think it's a couple of ways to think about it.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Christine. Val, would you like to add your perspective in terms of for organizations, where do they start to choose DEI programs for themselves? And also for organizations who are in the middle of the journey, how do they expand? What's the next step? What are some principles to think about?
Yeah, sure. I think that Armand and Christina again hit it spot on there. And Christine, I'll say I know Mary Lynn. She is all the things that you just said and more. She's great. I serve on the board for the Tennessee Aquarium here in Chattanooga, and she's leading all of the diversity work that we're doing there. So kudos to you, Marilyn. But I'll say just truly organizations, this work is daunting. There's so much out there, so many areas that you can begin your journey to the point that it could just be very overwhelming and you just don't know where to start. We're sharing a lot of information with you all right now, but I would say take that all in stride. It's because we've been doing this for a long time. Believe me, when we started our journeys at multiple points in time within our organizations, we were in the same place that some of you all are, trying to think through, where do I begin this journey? And so for American Water, we started our journey in 2017, not that long ago, and did not have my role as Chief Inclusion Officer. We did not have a budget for I&D. We didn't have that support. What we had was a group of passionate individuals that I reached out to as an executive sponsor of our Inclusion and Diversity Advisory Council, of saying, do you all want to embark upon this I&D journey with us to figure out where we're going to go with American Water with this? And oh, by the way, we had a CEO that gave her full support, as well as a board of directors. That's all we had in 2017. So there was a group of 12 of us, very ambitious, enthusiastic employees that was going to do what? We were going to change the world, because we had all the answers of what we needed to do at American Water. And what we had to realize really quick is that we didn't have all the answers. We needed to take time to really assess where we were as an organization. And what we did is we took about 6 months. This is before we made the first data analytic approach or any recommendations. We took that first 6 months and we held employee focus groups across the entire company. We spoke with over 450 employees, and we had a number of employee groups, between 8 and 12 people in those groups. And we just asked questions. We wanted to hear, where is American Water getting it right? What are we doing? And at that point in time, we had like a short list of what we were getting right and a whole big list of where we needed to improve. But we took all that in stride. And then we also said, there are companies out here that's doing a lot of darn good work in this space. We don't have to recreate the wheel. Let's go and ask those companies if we can talk with their inclusion and diversity officer or those that are leading this work. So we identified ambitiously 8 companies that we wanted to reach out to, and every single one of them said yes. So we took field trips. We divided and conquered. We went to Walmart's corporate office and spoke with leaders at Walmart. We went to Blue Cross Blue Shield here in Tennessee, Lexmark in Kentucky. We went to several of our peer utility companies, and we sought and spoke with them about, how is this work going for you? What have you learned along the way? What can you tell us that will help us to not go down and make some of those same mistakes that you made and take away your learnings? We pulled all that information together and we developed our plan for ourselves. And we had to realize that we needed to start where we are. And so out of that, we identified 4 areas that were going to be our focus, and we had to stick to it. Communication was key, internal, external communication. Training was another area, employee engagement, and workforce and succession diversity. Those were our 4 key areas. From 2017 all the way up until this year, we did not waver on those. We also identified up front that we were going to refer to it as diversity and inclusion. We decided that we were going to say inclusion and diversity. That was very intentional for us. We wanted to put inclusion first, create an inclusive environment, all that comes with that, how we define it. And diversity will be an outset of that, but also it will be a result of it, but it's not going to take the back seat, but we wanted to put inclusion first. Beyond that, we, 2 years later in our journey from 2017 to 2019, we established, okay, it was 12 of us. There's not so much we can do. How are we going to bring others into the fold? So we rolled out and stood up an inclusion and diversity champion network. So we had to have boots on the ground. We needed people that were going to be able to continue to immerse this into our business. So we had over 200 I&D champions that work within our network to evolve our messaging and the work that we do with I&D. And I know I'm saying a lot here, but I'm being very intentional about it. We also were clear that I&D was not a program. So if anybody said the P word, it was a wordy dirty. No, it is not a program. And we had to correct it in the moment. Our ELT is completely behind that, and our board of directors. It is who we are. It's embedded in our culture. So we took time, and we see our people that say program, not many, but they can see it on my face when they say I&D. No, it's not a program. Safety is not a program for us. I&D is not a program for us. It is who we are. It's how we operate. So that's kind of where we started our journey. And I think as individuals that are starting your journey, this is a good way for you to maybe take that step back and do that evaluation. Fast forward, companies that are a lot more involved in this space, what can you do? I'll say it's exactly what we did this year. We have a budget now for I&D. Yay, cha-ching, I have a budget. So we have dollars in place. We have my role as a company that's leading this. I actually have a team of people that's working with me and that are passionate, and they're actually on my team getting paid as a salary. It's their job. It's not an add-on. And we've taken a lot of our work over the last 5 years, and we've said, how do we evolve it? We still have a ways to go. And I've actually worked with the team, circulated across the business as well. We have a very robust 5-year strategic plan of what we're going to do over the next 5 years. And so we have 7 areas within this strategic plan, which are beyond those 4 areas that I spoke with you all about, that speaks to data and analytics, transparency, also ownership from leaders, leader ownership and accountability across our organization, the community work that we're doing externally, so that's important for us as well. And where we're at now is working through how we're going to, what is year 1, year 2, and year 3 going to look like for us of measuring the outcomes for that.
Wow. Christine, thank you. This is exciting, and congratulations on the big achievement. Just one quick follow-up before I see the floor to our participants. You mentioned you picked up 8 companies that you wanted to do field trips and study their practices. How did you select those? Based on what? Because you mentioned some like Walmart. It's not in your industry. It's something else. So how did you select those?
We just went on to the google.com, and we also looked to see what companies were being recognized for their work. And so this is what we just decided, hey, Walmart's doing some good work in this space. They've actually received awards, and they have recognition for this. They're on the Diversity Inc.'s top employer list with inclusion and diversity in their focus here. So we use Diversity Inc. a lot as well for identifying some of those companies, and we just narrowed it down. And like I said, we had the 8, and everyone that we reached out to said yes.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing your time, your experience, and your wisdom with us. This is really, I'm psyched up by your stories and insights. I'm really excited about the work that we're all interested in doing. Otherwise, we wouldn't be in this room together. So thank you so very much. I have taken down many notes, just like Marilyn too. So I have the marathon idea, the translating these inclusion ideas or practices in daily practice. So the microaggressions that Christine talked about, and these listening sessions, these bottom-up ideas. And I love the Champions Network. It's really through people on the ground in different areas that push, who gives momentum to our effort. And my favorite idea is this IND is not a program. It is who we are. This really ties everything into our identity. Then it becomes part and parcel of everything we do, permeates our how we live and how we breathe and how we go through our lives. Thank you so very much again, everyone.